Good morning, everyone. Today we will be looking at the history of Prussia in the 18th century. Prussia was Europe's newest great power, but had a large impact on the continent in the century leading up to the French Revolution. In the early medieval period, the German people had been largely found west of the River Elbe, where they had lived since the fall of Rome. The lands between the River Elbe and the River Rhine, however, were overpopulated, leading to famines being common and farmland being exhausted. As a result, German settlers began to move ever further eastwards, looking for economic opportunities. German expansion into the Baltic region brought them into military conflicts with the local population, most notably with the pagan Prussian and Lithuanian peoples who lived there. Over time, this economic colonization effort developed a religious character, best symbolized by the founding of the Teutonic Order. The Teutonic Knights were granted permission of the Pope and the Holy Roman Empire to invade Prussia and Lithuania, convert the local people, and rule the area as they wished. Over the course of a bloody 50-year struggle, marred by horrendous acts of brutality, the Knights subjected Prussia and largely replaced the previous inhabitants with German settlers. The Teutonic States, as the new kingdom became known, became one of the richest in Europe, ably exploiting its large reserve of amber as well as its important location on the Baltic trade route. After dominating the region in the 1300s, this Teutonic state fell into decline following defeat in 1410 in the Battle of Grunwald against the combined might of Poland and Lithuania. A century later, the remnants of the order, now much weaker, converted to Protestantism and swore fealty or subservience to the King of Poland. The name of Prussia re-emerged for the lands the former order, now a duchy, controlled. The flag of Prussia became an eagle, branded with an S and with a crown around its neck, signalling the control of the Polish crown and its king over it. The following century was a quiet one, although the capital of Prussia, Königsberg, did become a centre for Protestant learning and culture in the region. Prussia slowly began to regain its presence and power through a stroke of luck. In 1618, on the verge of the 30 Years' War, the duchy was inherited by the Margrave of Brandenburg, a member of the Hohenzollern dynasty. Brandenburg was itself a former colonial province, and its capital, the small town of Berlin on the sandy banks of the river Spree, was a backwater in the Holy Roman Empire. It was, however, notable for being both Protestant and an electoral state, meaning that it was one of the states who helped choose the Holy Roman Emperor. This made Brandenburg a target for Catholic invasion during the 30 Years' War, during which it suffered some of the worst violence seen by any of the German states. Berlin was burned down more than once and suffered a loss of half of its pre-war population. Following the war, Prussia-Brandenburg slowly rebuilt under the leadership of its ruler, the so-called Great Elector, Friedrich Wilhelm. The Elector was aided by the decline of Poland-Lithuania, which lost a series of conflicts to Russia and was invaded by Sweden, which for a time conquered most of the country. In 1701, the Prussians were powerful enough to end Polish interference in their country and become a kingdom in their own right. At the Holy Roman Emperor's insistence, however, the Prussian king, who crowned himself, was not allowed to be called King of Prussia, but rather had to be referred as the King in Prussia, a subservient position. The second king in Prussia, another Friedrich Wilhelm, introduced many of the reforms that Prussia would become famous for throughout Europe. Friedrich Wilhelm has gone down in history as the Soldier King, an apt name for a man who greatly expanded the Prussian army to a point that its size was 4% of the entire Prussian population. For reference, this would be like the US Army today having 13.5 million active duty troops. The ranks of this army were formed from Prussian peasants and foreign mercenaries. Nobles technically didn't need to be in the army, but were shamed if they did not sign up as officers. The Soldier King also launched an extensive administrative reform of his small kingdom, to the extent that the entire bureaucracy, which the king closely micromanaged himself, was geared towards supporting the army. Efficiency meant that whilst the army expanded, the kingdom actually turned massive profits and generated a large financial reserve. Despite his fanatical commitment to drilling the Prussian army, the Soldier King used it in only one war, to conquer the city of Stettin from Sweden. His successor, Frederick II, would embark Prussia on a very different course of action. Before he came to the throne, Frederick had been known as a cultured prince interested in Enlightenment policies. Few suspected his military genius or his willingness to put his military acumen into action. It thus shocked European opinion when, just 6 months after taking the throne, Frederick attacked the nearby province of Silesia, which was owned by the Habsburgs themselves, Europe's most powerful family. What was even more surprising was that Prussia, with the aid of its French ally, was able to win a series of battles over the Habsburgs over the following 5 years, despite nearly always being outnumbered and outgunned. Silesia was a province rich in farmland and minerals, and containing a number of large towns in which the beginnings of an industrial revolution could just about be seen. Its acquisition thus catapulted Prussia into the ranks of the great powers. This was much to the dismay of Austria and its Empress Maria Theresa, who saw Prussia and Frederick as major threats to Habsburg control of the Holy Roman Empire. The next century would see both Prussia and Austria struggle for mastery in Germany, a struggle that often turned violent. Maria Theresa's desire to reclaim Silesia was well known throughout Europe and encouraged Prussia to ally with Great Britain and invade Saxony, two events which, as we have seen, precipitated the massive 7 Years' War. Despite a series of victories in the war, once more against the odds, in 1760 Frederick was facing the loss of his kingdom in the face of an assault from 4 different directions. A large Russian army even took Berlin itself. Prussia was saved by a miracle. The death of the Russian Empress and the assumption to the Russian throne of the pro-Prussian Emperor Peter III led to Russia signing a peace with Frederick and withdrawing its troops from Germany. The Austrians were, without their Russian ally, themselves forced to sign a peace with their hated opponent, a peace which left Silesia in Frederick's hands. At home, Frederick instituted a series of Enlightenment policies which earned him the praise of the French philosopher Voltaire, who referred to Frederick as a philosopher king. Skeptical of religion, Frederick introduced religious tolerance to Prussia, allowing his subjects to follow whatever religion they wished. This policy had the added benefit of increasing the loyalty of Catholics to the crown, and allowed Frederick to interfere in the policy of more churches than just his own state church. Frederick also heavily invested into scientific research and institutions. He introduced into Prussia a secondary education system of the gymnasium, which is still recognizable in one form or another in Germany today. We should be careful not to praise Frederick's rule without comment. Voltaire and other Enlightenment philosophers at the time conveniently overlooked the brutal Prussian colonization of Poland which was occurring, as the Prussian state flooded Polish lands with settlers from all over Germany, much as the Teutonic Knights had once done. As with the English colonization of North America, many of the settlers were fleeing religious persecution. In this case, many came from the Catholic states of southern and western Germany. Colonization efforts were increased after the first partition of Poland in 1772, in which Frederick took large swathes of Poland into his realm, uniting the two halves of his kingdom into one. Prussia was joined in this endeavour by Russia and Austria, with all three powers distrusting each other whilst they greedily took more of Poland for themselves. Frederick died in 1786 after a long reign of 46 years. He subsequently went down in history as Frederick the Great for his conquests as well as his cultural and economic policies. Most likely a homosexual, Frederick was succeeded by his nephew, who followed the Great Prussian tradition of being named Friedrich Wilhelm. Friedrich Wilhelm would nonetheless differ from his ancestors by being an ineffective king, whose efforts to defeat the French Revolution came to failure. The legacy of the Soldier King and Frederick the Great would, by contrast, loom over Prussian, and subsequently German, society and culture for a long time to come. Prussia was romanticized as a warrior kingdom led by the wise House of Hohenzollern, who were destined to unite Germany by conquest and lead it into greatness. The influence of the army and the bureaucracy on Prussia would continue until 1945, and have unfortunate implications for the country as well as its successor, the German Empire.